The British are coming! The British are coming! I will lay my lanterns right here on the table. I'm Brent Carson. I today am playing the part of Paul Revere. It was a little over 60 years ago that I, during summer vacation, was very fortunate to make a wonderful trip to visit my aunt, who was living over in Hartford, Connecticut. And I went there during the summer, spent about 2 weeks with her, and we made a trip for about 3 days up to Boston and that area. Now, I had some interest in history already. At the time, I was a young junior high student, probably a young junior high student at the time, and this whole thing seemed to come together in a perfect storm in one sense, and I mean in a good sense. In this sense of about 2 or 3 years before I went over, was a movie that came out, the Disney movie, Technicolor. It was that one of Johnny Tremaine. Now, went to the movie theater and saw that, and for those who may not remember Johnny Tremaine, the basic thing was, it was a young teenager who was living in Boston at the time, just before the Revolutionary War, and he was being a part of the main events of the time, the Boston Tea Party, the Paul Revere's Ride, and Lexington and Concord, and he also became he was a fictional character, of course, but he ended up getting a job during this movie working as an apprentice for Paul Revere. Well, that was for a kid in later grade school. That was quite a fascinating thing for us back then. So there had been that. And then, at this point, if I were live with you all right now, if you were all right here, I would probably be here at the Myers Inn and ask you to raise your hand if you remember the poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. If a teacher that you had ever had in, say, a grade school had ever read that poem to you, and I saw Roger Roberts here, he raised his hand right away. That was sort of a poem that was almost expected in grade school, and as I recall too, it always usually involved a picture book going along with it as the teacher read, showing the pictures. And as you know, a grade school kid loves to be read to. So that perfect storm of Johnny Tremaine, the poem of A Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and that trip to Boston really tied it all together, and I would say probably had a lot of influence over a lifelong interest in history. Well, regarding that poem, I'd like to recite that to you now. The poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1, if by land, 2, if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm." Then he said good night, and with muffled oar, silently rowed to the Charlestown shore just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide in her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war. A phantom ship with each mast and spar across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hawk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend, through alley and street, wonders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms, the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the church, up the wooden steps with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, where he startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath the churchyard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, "All is well." A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead, for suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now looked on the landscape far and near. Then impetuous stamped the earth and turned to tighten his saddle girth, but mostly he watched with eager search the lonely belfry of the church as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looked on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to his saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. The hurry of hooves on a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a balk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles, in passing, a spark, struck out by a steed that flies fearless and fleet. That was all. And yet, in the gloom of the light, the fate of the nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in its flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides. And under the altars that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It is 12 o'clock by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Bedford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 o'clock by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting house windows, blank and bare, gazed at him with a spectral glare as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge at Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing across the meadows brown. And one lay safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be laid dead, killed by a British musket ball. You know the rest from the books that you have read, how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane and crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road and only pausing to fire and load. And so through the night went Paul Revere. And so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance, not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore, for born in the night wind of the past, through all our history to its last, in the hour of danger and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. So the poem, written in 1860 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, published in 1861, and in doing that, in publishing that, he, thinking of the time when it happened, you know, it's 85 years past the time of the events. And at that point, of course, there was, he was on the verge of the Civil War. Now, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, a little bit about him, he came from Maine, he ended up in Boston, he taught in Boston, Harvard. He wrote many different poems, but this one, the reason for writing it was because of the Civil War. It was down to the point where, with the war imminent, he wrote this as a patriotic gesture, pulling on the heartstrings of Americans to see if they wouldn't go back to their roots, if they wouldn't think back to that time in history of what all they went through to begin this country, and are they going to throw it all away? He was an avid abolitionist, anti-slavery. He was a good friend of one of the main senators who was also an abolitionist, and he was very much on that. He also was quite concerned that they're going to fight this war, and that great experiment of beginning this new country is going to disappear. The country is going to fall apart, and there will be no more country. So he writes this poem. There's a problem. In fact, there are a lot of problems. One is, the poem sounds nice, but has a lot of mistakes. A lot of mistakes. A lot of things that just did not happen, that were not true in the poem. And in fact, there was somewhat outrage among some people, particularly descendants of those who were also descendants of people who had ridden that night. Because, of course, it wasn't just Paul Revere writing, it was numerous other people writing. And they wondered, why didn't they get mentioned in this poem? Particularly, there was a family by the name of Dawes. William Dawes was one of the main writers, and he wasn't mentioned in there. And, you know, as I got older, I began to think, you know, well, I've heard that one of the main reasons would have been simply because it didn't sound right. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. If it instead had been, listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of William Dawes, it didn't rhyme. And the mistakes that were throughout this poem, things that just didn't happen. For example, the Dawes family mentioned that there could have been more than 40 writers that night during that time period. William Dawes, as they said, William Dawes rode farther than Paul Revere, and he didn't get caught, which Paul Revere got caught. He was caught up by the British soldiers and officers, and his ride was stopped. Dawes was not. He managed to get away from those officers. The other thing is, as I say, he rode farther. They've estimated at time that perhaps he rode 16 and a half miles, Dawes did. Revere. rode about 12.5 miles that evening. Other things, though, about that event. One of them was the fact that he did not row himself across that bay in that boat. He had two people who were expert oarsmen take him across that evening. He did not see two lanterns hanging in the Old North Church tower. He did not wait on the other side. That wasn't part of what he actually did. He was still at home when those lanterns were up. Dawes left on his trip at about 8:30, they figure. On the other hand, they figure that Paul Revere probably left at around 11 or 11:30 at night. In fact, when the lights were up, as I say, he was still home. A lot of inaccuracies in that trip. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of things that are neglected today by historians who sort of write Paul Revere off as not having been the special person that he was, the person who was the hero of the time. Well, there are a lot of things, though, about Paul Revere. One reason that he did not see the lights, the lanterns, he's the one who was given the responsibility of going to the sexton of the church, the Old North Church, and telling him how many lights to hang in the belfry tower. That night, he snuck over to where the sexton lived. That was prearranged. He got there, and the thing about the sexton was this, too. He and his wife owned a boarding house where the British soldiers and officers were staying. They had like a little bar downstairs. They were down there at the first floor. The officers were playing cards, drinking. When Paul Revere arrives and looks in the window and sees them there, he sees his wife of this man, the sexton's wife, in there. But the sexton had made an excuse to go on to bed. He had a lot of things to do. He said the next day, I'm going to leave you and leave you here with my wife. I'm going on to bed. He actually went on upstairs, jumped out the second floor window into the yard behind, and there was Paul Revere waiting to tell him how many lanterns to hang up in that tower, which he then, with one other man, did go. Very dangerous thing, because there were British soldiers, not only in his house, but on the streets. And the minister of the church, where the Old North Church, was on the side of the British, even though most of the congregation was not, he was. So it was a dangerous thing to do. Paul Revere, after giving that direction, went back to his house to get ready. You see, the thing is, during all this time, was that this was not something that was just spur of the moment, that happened like in a day or two. This had been going on actually for months. The concern with the British and with their troops in Boston. And Paul Revere and others were a member of a group called the Mechanics, who were spies, and one of their ringleaders was Paul Revere. And it was all planned out ahead of time of what they would do. They needed people to relay all these messages over a great area. If anything was to happen, for example, moving those troops out to any of the villages nearby. Each one of the villages, or almost every village, even the smallest place, had a militia. The militias that existed in these villages, some of them had been going for more than 100 years. It's not like it was something new. Something else about the militias and the villages of that time period. The villages who had the militias chose a leader of each militia, elected by the militia itself. Well, the thing is, they might have been the leader of the militia, But these people were really independent. They didn't like taking orders from people. And the militia, anything that was decided, whether it was how long we're going to practice, how long we're going to drill, what we're going to do, when we're going to participate in some activity, that has to be by a vote of the militia, and the leader has no more say than just the one vote that everybody else has. Well, that's one thing about the militias. And so all of these militias had to be contacted, and they had to have riders. They also had learned that the night of this event that the British were going to close down every highway throughout the Middlesex area, that there would be riders and people to intercept you on these roads. It was going to be a dangerous time of trying to have these riders traveling about the countryside. It was decided ahead of time. Just say, for example, like the lanterns to be hung. Revere was over on the other side a few days ahead of time, or some time ahead of time, talking to some people, and some other person, not Revere, suggested that we need to put lanterns in that tower of that church as a warning to people to know how they're going to be traveling that night, so that riders get the word. Not that Revere would get the word. He would be on his own, already knowing this. But as Revere and all of them and all the mechanics were saying, the problem is we must get to Lexington and Concord that night. And we have to have a lot of riders in case people get caught, in case they get arrested by the British. One of the agreements was right away, the two main riders, Dawes and Revere, by Joseph Warren, said the agreement was, and they all thought this was a good idea, Dawes, you go around the bay and go through that checkpoint, and Revere, you are going to go on across the bay by boat and leave from that direction. The reason for Dawes going the other way, he was used to going that way. He even knew the British by name who ran the checkpoint. And when he went, you know, I said that Revere didn't ride as far. Revere didn't even own a horse. Not at that time. And of course, even if he owned the horse, he couldn't take it across the bay in the boat. But the horse that Dawes rode was a pack horse. It was a type of a horse that would haul items or pull things. It was slow, methodical, big, and balky, but not fast. And it was the regular horse that Dawes often took through that checkpoint. One thing about Dawes going through that checkpoint that evening was that as soon as he got across, just within minutes, the order came to shut it down completely. No one was to come through that checkpoint, no matter what, anymore. No one was to go across that bay by boat at any point during that evening, which is why the Somerset was sitting out there in that bay. That was a dangerous mission. In fact, it got to the point where the moon rising over the bay, as we mentioned, that part was true. And if it had been just a little higher, then he would have been spotted in that boat. The moon was rising, but it was still behind some of the buildings that were blocking it. And so he managed to get by the Somerset. Had he not gotten by the Somerset, he probably would have been killed. They would have shot him because everyone knew that no one was supposed to be out in that bay. He got across. The horse that he ended up getting that evening, in history they recorded is probably called Brown Beauty, and it was a lone horse, and it was a saddle horse. It was large, fast, not a racehorse, fast though, very sure-footed, very alert and quick to turn. It was the best possible horse around. And Revere, although he didn't own a horse at that time, he he was impressed by this and spoke about this later in life of what a wonderful horse he had for that evening, that it could turn on a dime, on just a short tug on the reins. So he was on a fast horse. It took him about an hour to make the trip. It took the pack horse with Dawes about another half hour longer than it took Revere. They were not going to Concord. They were going to Lexington because John Hancock, and Sam Adams, were there at the Clark home. There was a connection between Hancock and the Clarks, and they were there with his aunt and with his girlfriend, Hancock's girlfriend. They were staying with the Clark family. Problem was, people of Boston and Warren and all the others knew that those were two key people in this upcoming revolution. They must not be caught by the British, and they thought that the British, one of their main reasons for going out was to arrest them and ruin these chances for a revolution. And so their goal was to get to him, and by any means, going different directions, and that there had to have been other riders who were seeing the message of going by sea by the British from the lanterns, and they also were headed towards some to Concord, some to other places to tell people to get to Concord, to warn the militias and the villages and so forth. There were also other things. There were bells ringing, and there were gunshots fired, and other people just on foot going from place to place to warn the British or to warn the people that the British are on the move that night. Thing about that also regarding Paul Revere, though, he only rode 12 and a half miles that night, and yes, Warren or Dawes rode 16 and a half miles. But 2 weeks before this, Revere didn't ride 12 and a half miles or 16 and a half miles. He rode 61 miles to warn of another impending. He thought he had been told that the British are about to be on the move and that they were going, I believe it was into Connecticut. At any rate, he was told to ride by himself to get that warning out, and they said, as you can imagine, winters in the Northeast around Boston are terrible winters. Lots of snow and ice, tremendously cold, and he hit one of the worst nights. The snow and the ice was terrible. The temperatures were terrible, and he managed to make that ride by himself toward them. Of course, that wasn't his only ride either. He had ridden 18 times before the event of April 18th, just in the previous month or two, warning of different things and messages of what was going on. He was the main messenger to take messages to New York City, and to Philadelphia, which were much farther than 61 miles. So he was an expert horseman, and he was also one who was involved in this from the very, very beginning. He did get to Lexington, and he did beat Dawes by about a half hour's time in getting there because of the fact that, again, he was on the faster horse. The other thing is, in history, Dawes' job was not to warn people. His job was to go directly to Lexington on this slower horse as a possible way of getting there to warn Hancock and Adams. On the other hand, Revere, on leaving, was almost caught immediately, but managed to get away. He went a different route. He then stopped along the way various times to warn people, not just anybody. He knew the people, and he knew who he had to warn. He knew he didn't dare just go out shouting that the regulars are out. That'd be a good way to get caught. And there were many people who had not chosen the side of the Patriots yet anyway, who might turn him in. So he knew who he had to get to. He stopped many times along the way before he got to Lexington, warning them. And then they both arrived at Lexington. Hancock and Adams argued among themselves over whether or not they really took this seriously, whether they needed to leave. And Hancock, a very fiery individual, he had to be convinced not to join the Lexington militia, that he wanted to be right out there fighting them if they came to that town. Well, eventually, Hancock, Adams, and Clark, and the militia of Lexington all ended up at the tavern that evening. Now this is going over there at about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, and the militias were arriving, and they were in there drinking, and they were discussing, and they were arguing about the conditions and all that, and what's going to happen the next day. And then it was determined then that Revere and Dawes needed to move on and get over to Concord. That's when they took off towards Concord. The man with the name of Prescott joined them. They had only got not too far out of Lexington, and there were British officers. There were two that they saw, and the three of them then split off, and Prescott managed to escape by jumping over a wall on his new fresh horse that he had. Hancock got caught, and your third person there, Dawes, he managed to get away, although they were chasing him. And you say, well, Dawes didn't get caught. Well, no, officially he didn't get caught. No, he got bucked off his horse. He ended up on the ground, injured, horse got away, the officers didn't catch up to him, and he limped back to Lexington. He also never got to Concord. The other thing is, the interesting thing about Revere was after he got caught that evening. What had started out as 2 officers ended up being 10 who were surrounding him. And these people, some of them knew very well when he told who he was, they knew Paul Revere. Paul Revere did not hesitate to tell him who he was. And he was very belligerent. It's not like he was going to sit back and let this happen to him and let the British get away with all this. Now, they got him off his horse. And, by the way, Revere made a very spur-of-the-moment decision just before he left the house back in Boston that night. His gun was laying there. He debated about, do I take my gun with me? He decided, no, it's not going to help me any. He left his gun behind, and he was fortunate he did, or he would have probably been shot on the spot when he got caught. Officers, when they found out who he was and what he was doing, and he told them what he was doing, he said, I'm out warning people that you're on, the regulars are on their way here to Lexington. And he said, I am warning them that they're on their way. And he said, you can do to me what you want, but that's what I'm here for. And then it got worse. He began berating the officers. And he said, and your main commanders are even worse. He said, they're coming by sea, and they were so stupid as to drop off their entire forces in the middle of a swamp. They left them off and they had to wade to shore. And it was they said that water was freezing water. And then they were so stupid as to follow the protocol of lining up in order of whose regiment went when. And that the Grenadiers went last. And in all the confusion, they held them in line for between 3 and 4 hours. By the time they got everything all together, after having waded through this on a cold night, and the water freezing. And then they finally got to moving on, and then they got to a bridge to cross over this other stream. And the officers decided, no, we can't do that because that might waken people who are living around in the area. We're going to have to wade the stream up to their waist. They were just starting to dry out, and now they're wading in this freezing water again, marching on. Their clothing was soaked. Their boots, their shoes, which, by the way, they didn't wear right and left shoes. They wore both. The shoes were the same, squared off on the end, and they just switched them every day to the opposite foot. They were terrible for marching in. And this army, which was now hungry, tired, was told to march on towards Lexington. Revere was telling the officers who caught him, said, go ahead and kill me, and they kept holding the pistol to his head. You can shoot me now, kill me, I don't mind at all. He said, my job has been done because you are in trouble. He said, you will not survive this if you don't get out of here now. Because he said, the militias from all over are on their way here. You will be outnumbered. And then there were some gunshots being fired in the distance. And the bells were ringing in the distance. And the officers got more and more concerned. And so they finally decided that they had better let him go. They took his horse, but he talked them out of not only not holding him, but of getting out of there so that they would be safe. In the end, by the way, as they were coming back towards Lexington after having been arrested, he gets back to Lexington. He's told that the British are almost on their way, and they are almost here. And one of the people who lived in the Clark home said, we have a problem. Hancock's papers are in a trunk. All of his important papers of the Revolution are in there, and we must get them out of that house before the British get here and search the house. So he said, I cannot carry this trunk on my own. So he and this other gentleman carry the trunk down the steps, and by now the British are arriving on the square at Lexington. They are already arriving there. The militia has already lined there. And here comes Paul Revere with this other man, dragging a trunk through the lines to get it to safety, with no concern of his own other than getting that trunk carried away. Even at that point, he was still with it. In the end, he survived all of this. He wasn't a silversmith. He lived through the Revolution. He even became noted in industry as being the first person to actually develop rolled copper in sheets. His factory or his industry did that. Revere had 15 children. One wife passed away, he remarried, and he had more children from that family, so he had many descendants, and very much deserves to be the person who history now seems to downgrade or say that he really wasn't the man that he was made out to be in the poem. I would contend that Paul Revere was very much the man that he was made out to be, that even though the mistakes in the poem were there, he definitely was the man during that particular time period of warning people and letting people know that the British were on their way, and with no fear at all for his own life. In my trip to Boston, I can recall that going to Boston and seeing the Old North Church and visiting Paul Revere's home as a child, and seeing that statue of Paul Revere on the pedestal as though he is riding that evening for Paul Revere's ride with the North Church back behind. And I was always so proud of that picture. As I got older and I began to hear, well, he wasn't the main person that he was made out to be. But then, as I began studying that more, I found out that the tarnish that had sort of gone over in my mind of the feelings of Paul Revere was not the great person made out in the poem. But in more study, find out that absolutely he was, though those things in the poem may not have been correct, as a person and as a leader during that time, he was every bit the person. I wish I were here with you to answer your questions, but thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. And I assume, Roger, they will be seeing this in April, right?
Right.
Closer to the time of Paul Revere's ride.